A grown man was reportedly on the verge of breaking down this week over a letter. Not a medical letter, not word of a death in the family, just a letter from a committee. And here's the twist that shoves this story from merely sad into genuinely astonishing. That letter landed after his father, the King of England himself, had already extended to him and his family a fully secured wing of rooms inside Buckingham Palace, watched over 24 hours a day by the very same security machine that has shielded King Charles across London for decades. He was handed the keys to the most heavily guarded address in the country, and according to those doing the reporting, it still wasn't enough, because what Prince Harry actually wanted wasn't a secure bed for his family. He wanted a motorcade. Stick with me on this, because tucked inside this story are two hidden trapdoors, and before we finish, I'm going to pull both of them open. The first is a document filed in Harry's own lawsuit, submitted by Harry's own legal team, that quietly demolishes the single most damning accusation his side leaked this week. And the man who caught it isn't some hostile critic. He's one of the most sympathetic royal reporters working today. The second is a date, a collision on the calendar so peculiar that even the neutral observers are lifting an eyebrow, and it lines up with the precise moment Harry is scheduled to stand up and speak on British soil. Hold both of those in your mind. We'll cash them in at the end, one after the other. Now, if you saw my previous video, you'll remember how this week kicked off. Just days before Harry was set to board a flight back to the United Kingdom, a confidential security dossier, one commissioned and paid for by his own private protection firm, the outfit reportedly pocketing a $3 million annual retainer, somehow found its way into the hands of ITV News and was on air within hours. 6 serious organized threats, 5 said to originate on British soil, a cocktail of religious extremists and political extremists. And the file concluded, to absolutely no one's astonishment, that the only workable solution was for the British state to shoulder his protection. I dismantled that report line by line last time. The provenance problem, the numbers that shrink into superfans the moment you press on them. The most terrifying incident in the whole dossier actually occurring in California rather than anywhere in Britain. So I won't chew through it again here. If you missed it, it's up on the channel, and it is genuinely the essential first half of what you're about to hear, because everything in this video is what unfolded after that leak. And what unfolded after the leak is, hand on heart, one of the swiftest and most total public relations meltdowns I've ever had to cover. Begin with the move nearly everyone overlooked because it was carried out quietly, well away from the flashbulbs, while the leaked file was mopping up every headline. The palace made its move. King Charles offered the Sussex family accommodation at a royal residence, widely reported to be Buckingham Palace itself, rooms tucked inside one of the most fortified perimeters anywhere in the Western world. Think for a moment about what that offer actually is. Armed officers manning the gates, police protection woven into the architecture itself, drivers on standby, secure grounds where Archie and Lilibet could run around without a single stranger inside half a mile. By any rational measure, that is a complete answer to the question, can my family sleep safely on British soil? And it was, without any ambiguity, a father's gesture. A man who hasn't laid eyes on those grandchildren since June of 2022, opening the biggest door available to him, the only door he actually owns. Because here is the constitutional reality this whole saga keeps smashing into, and I need you to have it firmly lodged in your head before anything else fits together. The king does not command police protection. He never has. That authority belongs to a government committee known as RAVEC, working alongside the Home Office. Members of the royal household may sit at that table, but they do not lead it, and they do not issue its orders. The king can offer what belongs to him personally: a residence, a welcome, a guarded roof. What he cannot do is instruct the state to allocate armed officers to a private citizen. And make no mistake, by his own declaration to the world in 2020, a private citizen is precisely what Harry now is. So the palace offer wasn't a token gesture or a snub. It was the absolute ceiling of what a father inside a constitutional monarchy has any power to give. Run the offer against your own life for a moment, because ordinary scale is the best lie detector we've got. Picture yourself anxious about your family's safety on a trip, and a relative responds by handing over the keys to the most heavily guarded compound in the whole country. Walls, gates, armed professionals, secure transport, the whole package, no charge, for as long as you need it. Would you turn around and tell journalists you'd been abandoned? Would the people you briefed later describe you as devastated? Or would you say thank you, tuck your children behind those walls, and sleep more soundly than you had in years? There's only one scenario in which that offer registers as a defeat, and it's if the trip was never really about where anyone was going to sleep in the first place. And Harry's camp treated the offer as an insult because what he wanted, what this entire 6-year crusade has ultimately been aimed at, is the next tier up. Full-time police protection, armed officers assigned to his person, a motorcade sweeping him around the country wherever he decides to go. And you have to grasp just how rarefied that tier really is, because this is the part the sympathetic coverage always keeps politely blurred. That level of protection is essentially reserved for the sovereign and the direct line of succession. Princess Anne doesn't get a permanent motorcade for private trips. The Edinburghs don't, the Gloucesters don't. Working members of the royal family, people carrying out engagements for the crown week after week, operate with proportionate arrangements and for large chunks of their lives with exactly what everybody else gets, a liaison contact and a system watching quietly from a distance. Harry, a non-working royal residing in Montecito, California, was demanding a package that outranks the security given to the anointed Princess Royal of the United Kingdom. Frame the demand honestly like that, and the committee's answer stops looking cold and starts looking inevitable. But the answer still had to be delivered, and it's the reporting on what happened when it arrived that pushed this week from disagreement into full-blown drama. According to sources quoted across the coverage, when RAVEC confirmed the family would not be receiving full police protection, no motorcade, no assigned armed detail, Harry was devastated and close to tears. He'd assumed, this source said, that because he was bringing the children, and because his father had made a royal residence available, the committee would finally cave and hand him what he's been chasing all along. It did not. That same reporting says the king gently made his own position clear. He longs to see his son and his grandchildren, and he will not step into security decisions because he cannot. Sit with that source quote for just a second because it inadvertently tells you the entire story. He assumed that because he was bringing the kids and because his father had opened the palace, he would land the protection. Read it again. The children and the accommodation are cast, by his own camp's own briefing, as inputs, chips placed on the table to unlock an output. That is not the language of a family visit. That is the vocabulary of a negotiation. And I want to be careful and honest here, as I always try to be. Wanting your children safe is the most human instinct there is, and I don't doubt for a second that somewhere underneath the strategy, that instinct is genuinely present. But the architecture of the thing, as briefed by his own team, is impossible to miss. The visit was pitched as a package deal, and when the committee declined the package, the disappointment wasn't that the trip suddenly became dangerous. The palace rooms were still sitting right there, as safe ever gets. The disappointment was that the pressure play had failed. And if you want to make sense of the demand itself, the motorcade, the tier above the Princess Royal, borrow a concept from negotiation psychology for a moment. Once you see it, the whole 6 years suddenly snaps into focus. Negotiators call it anchoring. You open with a demand so wildly beyond reality that it drags the entire conversation toward your end of the table, so that when you eventually settle for less, that less still lands miles above what you'd ever have been offered cold. Ask for the king's own protection tier, and abruptly a permanent armed detail sounds like a compromise. Ask for a permanent armed detail, and abruptly officers for every visit sounds like the reasonable middle ground. The palace suite, the liaison officer, the genuinely proportionate offer is engineered to feel like a snub purely because of where the anchor was thrown. It's a genuinely effective technique in the world of business, but it has one famous fatal weak spot. It only works on a counterparty allowed to negotiate. And Ravec is not a counterparty. It's a rules body. It doesn't haggle. It assesses. And it has now assessed this file, this family, and this campaign more times than any comparable case in its history, and returned the same answer every single time. Hurling anchors at a body that cannot be dragged doesn't move the table. It just fills the water with iron. And after 6 years, the iron is all anyone can see anymore. That's when the briefings began pouring out, and the picture they painted, presumably with his camp's blessing, was stranger than anything his critics could ever have invented, because friends and insiders, quoted across a wave of outlets, started describing how Harry now lives. Hotel rooms swept for listening devices before he'll set foot inside them. Phone numbers switched out constantly, his movements known only to a tight ring of trusted aides. Decoy vehicles reportedly deployed on some trips to throw off anyone possibly tracking him. One insider described a heightened state of vigilance. Another said every plan now starts from the worst-case scenario as a default, the working assumption being that someone is watching, someone is listening, someone already knows exactly where he is. Now, I'm going to do something here that the rest of the coverage has refused to do, and it matters to me that you hear it clearly. I am not going to play doctor. A great deal of commentary this week reached straight for clinical vocabulary to describe this man, and I think it's lazy. I think it's cruel. And honestly, I think it lets him off the hook, because it turns a story about choices into a story about symptoms. I cannot see inside Prince Harry's head. Neither can any of the people flinging diagnoses around a comment section. What I can do, what you and I are entitled to do, is take the portrait his own camp has painted and test it for internal consistency. Because feelings are private, but behavior is public, and the behavior does not add up. Hold that thought, because the campaign was about to climb yet again, and this time it wandered into genuinely dark territory. Not content with briefing disappointment, the Sussex side started briefing accusation. The complaint, filtered through Newsweek's royal correspondent, was that the palace itself had damaged them. That by allowing the Buckingham Palace offer to leak into public knowledge, courtiers employed by his own father had gutted the value of the arrangement, because now photographers would know where the family might be staying and could stake out every entrance. Follow that grievance to its logical destination, because his camp certainly did. The suggestion, in its strongest briefed form, was that people inside the palace had knowingly exposed the family's location, which is only a hair's breadth from asserting that they had knowingly placed his wife and children in danger. His father's own staff painted in a briefing to an American publication as a threat to his grandchildren. And then came the comparison that made even sympathetic jaws hit the floor. Harry, in pressing his case for risk-based protection, has invoked the example of Salman Rushdie. Yes, that Salman Rushdie, the novelist who lived for decades under a formal death decree issued by a state, who was hunted across continents, and who eventually survived a frenzied physical attack that cost him an eye. That is the category of endangered person Harry has argued he belongs alongside. Now, in fairness, and I'll always give you the fairness, there is a technical root into this. Inside the British system, there exists a small category of individuals protected purely on the basis of risk rather than role. And Rushdie is the textbook public example of it. So when Harry's lawyers argued he should be assessed on risk, Rushdie's name was always going to appear as the reference case. But there is a canyon of difference between a lawyer citing a category and a prince inviting the entire world to see his own situation. Brunch in Montecito, polo in California, stadium appearances coast to coast, as parallel to a man who very nearly lost his life in a frenzied attack on a public stage for the crime of writing a novel. The comparison didn't make Harry look more endangered. It made the genuinely endangered look cheapened, and you could feel the coverage turn as the comparison landed. Which brings us to the first trapdoor, because the correspondent who relayed the courtier accusation, a man who has covered this couple with more patience and more sympathy than almost anyone in the business, did something this week that should honestly have been on the front pages by itself. He pushed back on air, and his weapon wasn't opinion. It was paperwork. He noted that in the court case Harry himself launched against the British government over his protection, the disclosed documents showed the exact opposite of a palace plot. They showed members of the royal household actively campaigning for Harry to keep his protection, in writing, arguing his corner inside the system on paper that eventually made its way in front of a judge. Let me say that again, slowly, because it's the single most important fact in this entire story, and it got buried under a week of noise. The written record, produced through Harry's own lawsuit, shows his family's household arguing for his protection, not against it. The conspiracy his camp has spent years insinuating, the whisper that courtiers around his father and brother secretly engineered his downgrade, is contradicted by evidence his own legal action dragged into daylight. He sued to expose a plot, and the discovery process turned up advocacy instead. There are own goals, and then there is scoring against yourself with a document you paid the lawyers to obtain. That is, trapdoor number 1. And notice who fell through it. Not Harry's enemies, his story did. When the friendliest reporter on the beat is the one holding up your own court papers against you, the campaign isn't being attacked anymore, it's being fact-checked. And an operation that can't survive fact-checking by its friends is an operation in its final act. But before we reach how that act ends, there are 2 more players we need to handle honestly, because the strangest reporting of the entire week wasn't really about Harry at all. It was about the woman not on the plane manifest, and a gift she sent to Los Angeles. Because while Harry's week was consumed by committees and briefings, Meghan Markle's week, according to the reporting, was pointed in a completely different direction. Word emerged of a warm public public reconnection with Kris Jenner, a visible gift, acknowledged online almost instantly. The kind of gesture that in Hollywood functions less like friendship and more like a press release. And say what you will about Kris Jenner, she understands fame better than almost any living person. When you send her a public token and she publicly receives it, you're not exchanging pleasantries, you're exchanging positioning, a signal legible to everyone in that industry that says, I still belong in this room. Now hold the two halves of this marriage's week side by side, because the geometry is startling. Harry, by every account, wants reconciliation with his family, wants Britain, wants his father, wants, in the deepest sense of the word, to go home. And in the very week he is fighting badly for that bridge back to Windsor, his wife is publicly reinforcing an entirely different bridge. The one leading to Los Angeles, to cameras, to brand deals, to the celebrity machinery that made his family wary in the first place. One bridge points east, the other points west, and a couple cannot walk in both directions forever. Some commentators went further, and I pass this along strictly as their speculation, clearly flagged as such, because it cannot be verified from the outside. They floated the possibility that the fear itself serves a purpose inside that household, that a husband who believes the outside world is dangerous is a husband who stays close, and that calming his fears has never visibly been part of the program. I don't know that. You don't know that. But I'll observe the one related fact that is on the record, drawn from years of coverage, which is that across all the documentaries, all the interviews, all the briefed articles, you can find abundant examples of this couple describing threats, and you will search a very long time for a single instance of her telling the world, or apparently telling him, that a threat was overblown and everything would be fine. The reassurance deficit is real, whatever its cause, and there were fresh, conflicting reports by the end of the week that Meghan may not be coming at all, and may not be bringing the children, which, if it holds, converts the entire family homecoming into something much smaller and much lonelier. And the children are where this stops being chess and starts being sad. So let's handle it plainly. If the threat picture painted in that leaked file were literally true, 6 live plots, 5 of them on British soil, hostile actors unaccounted for, then no loving parent would fly Archie and Lilibet straight into it for a promotional tour. Full stop. And no number of officers would change that calculation, because no protection on Earth deletes risk. It only manages it. So the announced plan to bring them permits, as I said in the previous video, only 2 honest readings, and this week's events sharpened both. Either the plan to bring them was never quite real, a card laid face up on the table to raise the emotional stakes for a grandfather who hasn't held those children in 4 years, or the plan was genuinely real precisely because in his heart of hearts, he knows the file overstates the danger. His own briefed reaction points the same way. When the protection was refused, the reported response was devastation at the decision, not a swift, relieved cancellation to get the children out of harm's reach. You grieve a lost bargaining position. You do not grieve escaping a danger zone. And there was one more item in the reporting that made observers wince. The suggestion that Harry hopes to visit Althorpe, the Spencer estate where Princess Diana rests, to show the children their grandmother's grave. And that cameras might come along too. I'll let you sit with the idea of that place, of all places, appearing in the same sentence as the word cameras. And I'll simply note that some doors, once you bring a crew through them, never quite close again. Follow the money one more time too, because the money has been the quiet narrator of this entire series, and it did not go silent this week. The private protection bill remains that reported $3 million a year every year in perpetuity. The prize remains what it has always been, the permanent, worldwide, state-funded protection that attaches to protected status and that in practice is almost never revoked. The kind of arrangement former prime ministers enjoy for life. And into that picture dropped one more briefing, this time to the New York Post, so strange I had to read it twice. The source described how, if the family does travel, they won't fly private, but will bring their own bodyguards, and then added, and this is the part that stopped me, that they know it will make the biggest spectacle, that they want photos of them being royal. Their own briefing, the biggest spectacle, photos of them being royal. For 6 years, the public story has been that this family wants privacy and safety. And here is a friendly source explaining in print that the security operation itself is being staged for maximum visibility. Protection as production design, a threat narrative with a costume department. I have covered this family for a long time, and I have never seen the quiet part said quite that loudly. Do the arithmetic on that prize once more, because numbers written out in words land differently when you slow them down. $3 million a year carried for a decade is $30 million spent on protection alone. Carried across the 30-year horizon that protected status effectively runs for former prime ministers, it climbs to $90 million. That size isn't a security budget. It's a second fortune draining silently out the back door of the first one. And no jam brand, no polo documentary, no podcast season refills it. Transferring it to the British taxpayer isn't one prize among several in this campaign. Financially speaking, it is the entire board. So how did the public actually receive all of this? Because that is the part of the week I think historians of this family will one day come back to. Not the file, not the committee letter, but the reaction. And I want to describe it carefully because the easy version of this section, the version half the channels covering this story have already recorded, is to read out the cruelest comments and laugh. I'm not going to do that, and I want to tell you why. Because the truth underneath the cruelty is actually far more devastating than the cruelty itself. Here is what happened, plainly. The comment sections turned, not divided, turned. Across video after video, outlet after outlet, thousands of separate viewers who have never spoken to one another converged independently on open mockery and on blunt, unsolicited verdicts about Harry's state of mind. And those comments were not fringe replies with 3 likes. They were routinely the most upvoted comments on the entire page, hundreds upon hundreds of approvals apiece. Commentators paid to stay measured on camera stopped being measured. Even voices who have defended him for years reached for language you could never have imagined attaching to this man a decade ago. I'm not going to repeat the specific words because I don't diagnose people from a desk, and neither should a comment section, and because a pile-on tells you more about the crowd than the man. But I am going to tell you what the pile-on means strategically, because that is where the real story is. Sympathy is the entire currency of Harry's public position. Think about it. He holds no constitutional role anymore, no duties, no institutional platform. Every deal, every documentary, every memoir, every security campaign has ultimately been financed by one asset: the public's willingness to see him as the wounded prince, the boy who walked behind the coffin, the man more sinned against than sinning. That asset is what made Netflix pay. It is what made the memoir a phenomenon, and it is the only conceivable force that could ever have pressured a government committee into bending its own rules on his behalf. This week, at the precise moment he needed that asset most, with the visit days away and the protection question at its climax, he discovered the account was empty. The leaked file was meant to summon protectiveness, and it summoned ridicule. The brief tears were meant to summon compassion, and they summoned punchlines. When a man says, "I am in danger," and a nation, in effect, replies with a raised eyebrow, the campaign isn't merely losing, it's over. And it ended not because his critics beat him, but because the audience stopped buying. And no committee on earth is moved by a performance the public has already walked out of. And there is one more layer here, the gentlest one, and I want to give it its full weight, because it's the closest thing this grim week produced to genuine humanity. Tucked inside all those briefings from friends and insiders, beneath the decoy cars and the swept rooms, the quotes kept ending in the same place. Those close to him, the article said, simply want Harry to find peace. They hope he can let his guard down before the fear takes him over completely. Read those lines again and notice what they are not. They are not defenses of the campaign. They are not endorsements of the threat file. They are the words of people watching someone they love live in a state of siege, much of it, by every visible measure, self-built, and wishing he could put it down. His fiercest critics and his closest friends, without intending to, arrived this week at very nearly the same place. The critics say the fear does not add up. The friends say the fear is eating him alive. Both can be true at once. And if they are, then the real tragedy of this week is not that a committee said no. It's that the palace rooms, the guarded walls, the grandfather waiting inside them, were the piece already sitting right there, pre-approved, keys in the door, and the campaign could not allow itself to simply say yes and walk in. Step back and tally the constituencies this single week managed to alienate, because I don't think any 7 days in this entire saga has burned so much, so fast, on so many fronts at once. The government committee, publicly second-guessed by a leaked file aimed at its own deliberations. The palace staff, briefed against by name of function, accused in an American outlet of endangering the children they've spent careers protecting. The genuinely threatened, from authors under real decrees to public servants under real watch, who saw their category claimed by a man with a palace on standby. The press, handed a confidential document by a camp that sues the press. The charities attached to the visit left planning around a family that may or may not appear. And the public asked one more time for sympathy. One more time. Always one more time. In the very same month, they watched a recovering princess climb 3 mountains for other cancer patients without issuing a single press release. Each of those constituencies on its own can be won back with time. All of them at once, in 1 week, days before you land, asking the country for the most expensive favor in its gift, is not a rough news cycle. It is a bridge burning itself from both ends, while the man in the middle briefs reporters about the smoke. Because remember, this is the same man who told the world in that extraordinary BBC interview after losing his court appeal that he wanted reconciliation with his father, and in the very same breath accused his father of standing in the way, of needing to step aside, of bearing responsibility for the blocked assessment. An interview so one-sided in its handling that the broadcaster itself later had to apologize for the absence of pushback. That is the pattern, repeated now for years, and this week was its purest expression yet. Reconciliation is requested through a megaphone with an accusation stapled to it. A hand is extended holding an invoice. And a family that has been burned by 2 documentaries, a memoir, an interview empire, and 1,000 briefings reads each new overture exactly the way you would, with one hand on the door and the other on its wallet. Now split the screen one final time, because this series keeps returning to the split screen, and this week produced the starkest one yet. While all of the above was detonating across the front pages, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was quietly finishing the story we opened this series with, the National 3 Peaks Challenge. Britain's 3 highest mountains, compressed by her team into a single 24-hour push for charity. No leaked itinerary, no advance press, and along the way, reported by those who were there, an unscripted encounter with a young boy named Ted, himself fighting cancer, who met the princess on a mountainside and called it one of the best moments of his life. 1 child, 1 hillside, 0 briefings, and it moved the country to tears of an entirely different kind. In the same week, Prince William spent a day packing supply kits for a homelessness charity, cameras catching him laughing at his own clumsiness, doing the unglamorous, repetitive, entirely unbriefed work that royalty actually consists of. And on the 1st of July, the family marked something heavier still, a private dinner in Scotland on what would have been Princess Diana's 65th birthday. Her elder son spent that day inside the institution she gave everything to, doing its work, honoring her quietly among family. Her younger son spent it an ocean away in Montecito, at the center of a story about leaked files, refused motorcades, and briefed tears. I don't say that with any relish. I say it because the contrast is the story and has been for 6 years. 2 boys walked behind that coffin. Only one of them ever found his way home, which leaves the second trapdoor, the one on the calendar. And I saved it for last because it reframes the entire week. Harry's long-running legal war with a major British newspaper group, one of the marathon cases that has ground through the courts for years, is reaching its verdict. And the timing of that verdict's public release has landed, according to those tracking the schedule, at the precise moment Harry is due to deliver his first public speech back on British soil. The precise moment. Now, court schedules are set by courts, and I'm not going to spin you a conspiracy in which the machinery of British justice arranges itself around one man's itinerary, because that is not how any of this works. But observe what the collision does regardless of who intended what. Whatever that verdict says, triumph or humiliation or the muddy middle, it will detonate in the news cycle at the exact hour his homecoming was supposed to own the cameras. If he wins, the papers become the story, and the speech becomes a footnote. If he loses, he'll be standing at a podium in Britain live as the country learns he has lost again. Either way, the one thing his team has always craved, a clean, controlled, single-message moment on British soil, has been structurally impossible from the day the visit was scheduled. Even his best-case scenario has an asterisk baked into it. A lot of people watching closely aren't buying the word coincidence. And while I won't join them all the way, I will say this. For a man who believes the universe of British institutions is arrayed against him, the calendar this month is confirming his darkest suspicions for him, free of charge. So let's build the final ledger, because this series has always closed with the accounts, and this week's accounts are brutal in their symmetry. Write 2 columns. In the first column, what was offered. A protected suite inside Buckingham Palace, the most defended civilian address in the kingdom. Round-the-clock security within its walls. Drivers. A grandfather undergoing treatment, by every report, in genuinely improving health and genuinely hopeful. Waiting to meet grandchildren he has not embraced in 4 years. A liaison officer's direct line for everything beyond the gates. And the quiet standing option that has existed all along. The unannounced private visit, the Balmoral route. No cameras, no crowds, no risk profile at all. In the second column, what was demanded? A motorcade, armed officers assigned full-time to a private resident of California, a protection tier outranking the Princess Royal, permanent status worldwide in perpetuity at public expense. Now look at the 2 columns and answer honestly. If safety were the goal, which column delivers it? The first one, completely, instantly. It isn't close. The first column is safety. The second column is standing, and a man who rejects guaranteed safety because it arrives without standing has told you more clearly than any leaked file ever could which of the 2 he was actually negotiating for. Time to close every loop. In order, as always. Trapdoor 1, the paperwork. The darkest accusation of the week, that courtiers around his own father exposed his family and worked against his protection, was answered not by a palace statement, but by disclosure from Harry's own lawsuit, highlighted by the friendliest correspondent on the beat, showing household members advocating and writing for him to keep his protection. The plot his campaign needs you to believe in is contradicted by evidence his own lawyers surfaced. When your conspiracy is debunked by your own discovery bundle, there is nowhere left for the story to go. Trapdoor 2, the calendar. His first speech back in Britain collides to the hour with the public release of his newspaper verdict, which means the homecoming was never going to be the controlled triumph it was designed as. The week that was supposed to force Britain to finally take his danger seriously ends with Britain unable to take him seriously. And that sentence, I suspect, will follow this visit whatever happens at the arrival's gate. And the deeper resolution, the one this whole video has been walking toward. This was the week the sympathy ran out, and sympathy was the last asset on the balance sheet. The file was discounted by its provenance. The tears were discounted by the palace room sitting empty and available. The accusation was discounted by his own paperwork. The spectacle was confessed to in his own camp's briefing. Every instrument this campaign has ever played was played this week at maximum volume simultaneously. And for the first time in 6 years, the audience heard the whole orchestra at once and recognized the tune. It was never a hymn about safety, it was an anthem about status. And the United Kingdom, from its government committee down to its comment sections, finally, unmistakably, declined to sing along. Here is the last image I'll leave you with. Somewhere in Buckingham Palace this week, there is a suite of rooms with fresh linen and armed men outside the windows, prepared for a family that may never arrive. Down the corridor, a king in recovering health keeps a door open that he's too constitutionally careful to say out loud he's desperate to see walked through. The safest place in Britain is holding a welcome, and 5,000 miles away, the man it was prepared for is briefing reporters about decoy cars. That is not a security crisis. That is a homesickness so proud it would rather be a hostage negotiation. And the saddest part, the part I genuinely hope he hears one day, is that the ransom was paid before he ever asked. All he has ever had to do is land and knock. The plane or the silence comes within days. Either Harry walks through that palace door or the empty suite becomes the most eloquent room in Britain. I'll be covering the landing, the speech, and that verdict the moment they break. And after this week, believe me, you do not want to hear it from anyone else first. Stay close.